Hello, dear ones, and welcome to music lovers, poetry lovers, and those who love to worship the Lord with music and song, and also for those who have an interest in music history and music theory. As before, I want to apologize for not being a more knowledgeable scholar or a more skilled musician and singer. Please forgive my many limitations. A lot of music theory coming up. Today we're going back in time to look at the biggest change ever in church music and in Western music generally. And I'll look at a couple of pieces still in hymn books today that go back musically to the medieval period. This episode will contain some interesting fundamentals for beginners, including the question of what is a scale, and some more advanced ideas, in particular the concept of consonance and dissonance, and how the understanding of these has changed. I'm Christopher Watson. I've long loved what is called early music. This term is variously applied to music from the early Baroque all the way back to the medieval period. And I love the history and culture of the medieval period. One of the things that first excited me when I began playing in the music group at my local Presbyterian church was that the hymn book contained tunes going well back into the high medieval period. Let's start with a short piece of music. This piece was taken from a medieval tune. In our time, it's either called Diva Servatrix, which is Latin for God's servant, diva being an adjective, Servatrix, the Latin feminine form, so they're both in the feminine form in Latin. And sometimes it's called the Bayeux melody or Bayeux melody, because the melody itself was found in a medieval book in Bayeux in France. It dates back to the 15th century. The book in this manuscript only has a melody, so it's been variously harmonized over the years. For my little piece, I imagined a sort of folk polyphony. They did this in those days. You could imagine medieval townsfolk hearing beautiful church music and listening, remembering it as they left the church, singing it, singing passages of it, and using it for their own songs. It was harmonized at various points in history. These sorts of medieval tunes became popular again in the 19th century. So let's listen to a harmonized version. It was harmonized in the 19th century. I couldn't find by whom. There are numerous examples differently done in the late 19th century, and I couldn't find the arranger listed for any of them. They're all just called medieval Bayeux melody or medieval melody. In New Zealand, on the wonderful radio show Hymns on Sunday, you might hear this tune paired with a text by Harold Riley called God Everlasting. It's a lovely piece, but the text is modern, so it's under copyright and I shan't use it. But let's hear Now God Be With Us, which was written in Europe by an author called Petrus Herbert in the 16th century. He was from Moravia, and was translated by a London woman, Catherine Winkworth, in 1863. I know I'm not the best singer, but St. Paul said, when you meet together, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and praise the Lord with all your heart. Now God be with us, for the light is closing. The light and darkness are of your disposing, and 'neath your shadow here to rest we yield us, for you will shield us. Let evil thoughts and spirits flee before us, till morning's dawning. Watch, protector, o'er us, in soul and body, from all harm defend us. Your angels send us. Now, we're going to look at quite a lot of music theory. I hope you find this interesting. I find music theory very interesting. We're going to look at some very fundamental questions. What are intervals? And where do scales, harmony, and chords come from? What are intervals? Intervals are the gap between two notes. They can be harmonic or they can be melodic, so the distance in pitch between two notes. In Western music, all the accepted intervals have names. I say accepted because in theory there could be an infinite number of intervals. You could go extremely small. The scale is derived from intervals and comes from nature. Scales and intervals and chords are natural. They exist in nature. Well, they're derived from things that exist in nature. The relationship between the notes of the natural intervals, in particular the ones that sound sweet, are mathematically simple ratios. That's the reason they sound pleasing. I'll just mention two for now, the simplest and most fundamental, the octave and the fifth. So if we look down here, here's C, and if you go all the way to the octave, and you have what they call C, and with an octave you put a little apostrophe there. The relationship in terms of sound waves between these two notes is 2:1, meaning for every one sound wave here, for every one wavelength, there are two here, which is why they sound like the same note. There's another very fundamental note or interval, which is G. The relationship between G and C is 3:2. So for every two wavelengths here, so every two, there are three here. Something like that. Not very well drawn. And that's why it sounds very, very close in harmony. I'd like to talk a lot more about these kinds of intervals another time. There's a huge amount of detail in the various intervals and the harmonies and the consonances and how they relate to the mathematics of nature, the mathematics of sound. But we'll leave it there for now. Anyway, this is the major scale. So here we go. We'll just name it C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Here is a fifth. We often write this as a Roman numeral. And here is a third. That's also a naturally occurring interval. The other notes in between are derived from these intervals, but it's a simple derivation. This has existed in lots of cultures throughout the world. It's almost universal. You'll see the pattern here. So, when you think of the two black keys and the three black keys in music, you can think of the black keys as being here, 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 here. That's where we get the two black keys and the three black keys on a piano. And for, musicians, guitarists, for example, will be very familiar with this because these are the patterns you have on the fretboard when you play. So let's hear some of these intervals. Let's hear the sound of the fifth and the sound of the third. First, the sound of the fifth. And now the sound of the third. So this note here, E, that's also a naturally occurring interval. That's the third. Note that here. We'll talk more about that. That's a very interesting interval mathematically and in the history of music. We'll talk more about that another time. But the idea of building a chord from these three intervals was fairly fundamental. And when you write music, you'll often see what they call a triad written like this. We talked about this last time. So it's a third and a third. So C is made of C, E, and G. And you can do that from any chord position. In the key of C, you then get D minor. See, it's a smaller third, so it's a minor. D, F, and A, E, G, and B. And again, it's a smaller interval. It's not two whole tones. It's a whole tone and a semitone, so that's a minor third. F, A, and C. And of course the notes keep going up here. G, B, and D. A, C, and E. This is an interesting one because B, D, and F doesn't have what we call a perfect fifth. It's a semitone and a semitone. We call that a diminished fifth. And in the key of C, the chord you build on B is called B diminished. All of these intervals can be used in chords. They all have names. So for example, you have a second, a third, that goes with that, a fourth, fifth, sixth. You'd probably call this a major seventh. The little triangle can represent major because the seventh is often associated with G. G is a very important chord in the key of C, and it has what we can call a dominant seventh. So G7 has, and in fact the term dominant applies to the G that's positioned in the scale, not the seventh. But this idea of a dominant seventh, so it's a whole tone below G. We'll cover this in a lot more detail, little by little, as we go along. Each of these can be played as what we call an extension of the chord. So you might get a chord with another note on top. Well, it can be in the middle, in fact. And they're sometimes referred to by different names. They're sometimes referred to as if they are occurring above the scale. So for example, the second, you'll often see this called, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 is an octave. That's the same note. This can be called a ninth, like this. Sometimes you'll see the major third referred to as a tenth. It's not really common. You can have it. The fourth, if it's part of another chord. So for example, if you've got a chord that has a fifth plus, for example, I'll play you an example here, which is what we call a minor 11th. So it's a minor 7th plus a fourth. Sometimes you'll see a chord called an 11th. The G, of course, well, you could call it a 12th. I don't really see that very often. If you wanted to be very precise about which G you're talking about, someone might call it a 12th, but we don't. The sixth is an added note anyway. But sometimes if it's in a jazz chord, that might be called a 13th. The 7th never has another name. The 7th is a fairly special chord, and I've never heard it called the 14th, ever. So here's the major scale again. You don't have to start on C. Let's imagine this is C. You don't have to start on C. You can build a scale on other notes. And a very common one is to build a scale on A. So let's just bring A over here. We'll follow the intervals along. So here we've gone 1, 2. There's our fifth. And here we have a semitone. We've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and A. This is what we call the natural minor. In the medieval period, they referred to this as the Ionian mode. They referred to this as the Aeolian mode. And you will often hear, you'll hear the chord of A minor relative to C called the relative minor. So A is the relative minor of C. And you can see C has C, E, and G. A minor has A, C, and E. So they share 2 notes out of 3. And of course, this is a minor scale. This here is a minor third. We write minor with a small m. And the minor third is derived from the intervals of the major scale. When you take a major third away from a fifth, you're left with a minor third. So we have a minor third, then there's a major third here, and we'll listen to the sound of a minor scale and a major scale. the medieval period, the Ionian mode and the Aeolian mode were not really used in plain chant. They were considered too worldly, although it's not quite true. They had a scale that really was the same as our major scale, but they didn't consider it to be the Ionian mode. But in the medieval church music and the beautiful, beautiful Gregorian chant, there are two very common modes that are built on D and E. These, let's look at them here. So of course, that little symbol, little flick there indicates a semitone. Tone, tone, semitone. These are modes built on D and E. This one's called the Dorian mode. And this has become popular again in modern music. You hear it a lot in jazz and sort of blues-flavored jazz. And this one's called the Phrygian mode. And it's existed in Western music in various forms a long time. There's a great deal to talk about when it comes to the minor scale. The minor scale has variations. The minor scale has a huge history behind it. These modes were used in quite a complicated and sophisticated way, and there are other modes as well. We'll talk a little bit more about modes another time. We'll talk a little bit more about the minor scale another time, and we'll talk about some of the concepts another time. But I wanted to introduce you to the idea of the intervals, the scales, and the modes. The modes are important for medieval music. We'll talk again about the Dorian mode, especially the Dorian mode and the Phrygian mode. Those were the big ones. There's a very beautiful piece in the Phrygian mode I'd like to look at later. And the Dorian mode will crop up because when some of the 19th century scholars were reintroducing medieval music into the hymn, sort of the hymn corpus, they converted a lot of Dorian mode to the natural minor because modern ears are not really adjusted to the Dorian mode. Some people hate it. That was quite a lot of fundamental music theory, so thank you for your patience. Now we're going to use a little bit of that to understand what happened between the early medieval period and the Renaissance. A lot of this happened slowly, pre-Renaissance, but it took off in the Renaissance. In art, the Renaissance reflects scientific discoveries, things like perspective and anatomy. In music, the big change that happened over time, but fairly quickly during this period, happened because of a change in aesthetic. So this word can be an adjective or a noun. Here it's a noun. Aesthetic describes the sense, or indeed the philosophy, of what is beautiful or attractive. There are three important types of music from the medieval period that have influenced hymns. In fact, all Western music, but my topic is hymns. There's plain chant. Plain chant is beautiful. You'll have heard Gregorian chant. Extremely refined and spare. It's a wonderful, wonderful genre. There were what I think of as people's music. We usually call these folk songs, medieval folk songs, but I don't really like the term folk song for medieval music. It's a bit misleading. It's patronizing. and a bit exclusionary because it wasn't a peasant's music by any means. It was, many sectors of society would have lovely, lovely songs. There's another genre of music that you don't hear much, but it's influenced Western music a lot and hymns a lot, and that's polyphony. I love polyphony. It's had a huge influence, and it had a long and ongoing influence on hymns. Polyphony is a compositional style made of interwoven melodies, rather than a single melody with supporting voices or a harmonic backup. Anyway, I'll come back to the topic of polyphony fairly soon. I want to play a very rough rendition on the guitar of a piece of late medieval polyphony from the Montpellier Codex of the 15th century. This performance is very rough and approximate and rather improvised. I'll put links in the description for some really proper performances of music from the Montpellier Codex. If you look at some of the images of this early music, in notation, you can see notation is really starting to develop. We won't go deeply into this now. There's too much to talk about. Anyway, medieval music is very sophisticated and increasing in complexity, artistry, and difficulty. Notation is developing. Rich ideas can be recorded on paper. We're on the dawn of the Renaissance, and yet you can immediately hear that this music exists on the other side of a line from us in time. It belongs to a different world. It feels very different to the music of our time. Why does it sound so alien? The answer is a very small thing. What characterizes this pre-Renaissance music is their aesthetic approach to consonance. So first of all, the great basis of much art and most Western music is tension and resolution. Consonance describes sounds that fit together. This is subjective. It's part of tension and resolution. Dissonance creates tension, and consonance resolves the tension. Dissonance and consonance are not the only ways to create tension and resolution. This is often done with where you are in the key. So returning from, for example, the dominant, the G, to the tonic, the C, is a form of tension and resolution. But dissonance does create tension. And an emphatic resolution needs consonance. So to resolve really strongly, you need your resolution to be consonant. So to be in tune, to sound relaxed, to sound settled. In the medieval period, going back to intervals, we talked about our intervals, the third, the fifth, and so on. And the really fundamental ones are the fifth and the third, because they're very primary ratios in sound waves. They fit together very sweetly. So in the medieval era, and for a long time before, thirds were considered to be an attractive dissonance. So they weren't consonances. Consonance was considered to be the unison, which is to sing the same note, the octave, to sing the same note an octave higher, or the fifth. Harmonies in this period don't resolve to major or minor chords. They resolve to fifths, unison, or octave. Major and minor chords are considered points of tension. And that tiny distinction between what is consonant and what is dissonant, and just deciding that this interval we now consider to be consonant. We consider it to be sweet enough to resolve to. Made a huge difference to music. I believe no other change in music was as great as this change, from regarding major and minor as dissonant to regarding them as places you could resolve to. And when this aesthetic sense changed, we moved from one world to another, to the musical world we live in today. I'd like to demonstrate this in my own fumbling style with a piece of music whose melody comes from plain chant, but that can still be found in a few hymn books. It's a lovely Christmas hymn, and it's one my mother liked. Could you hear the change? Of course you could. In its harmonized form, the tune for this hymn is called Corde Natus. In its plain chant form, and this is still sung in congregations or by performers, it's called Divinum Mysterium. The development of the tune took place fairly slowly. First of all, it was put into 3/4 time, in the 1500s by a gentleman called Theodoricus Petri. The usual text for this hymn is in English called Of the Father's Love Begotten. The Latin text is, of course, Divinum Mysterium, the same as the name of the tune. The Latin text was written by an early church father called Aurelius Clemens Prudentius, who lived from the 4th century to the 5th century, 348 to 413, so a long time ago. The text, as we know in English, was translated by the wonderful J.M. Neale. J.M. Neale is a brilliant translator of Latin texts and Greek texts too. Very interesting man. He will come up again in the future. The original melody was plain chant. The musical arrangement is by Henry Thomas Smart, a 19th century composer. What a team. We've got Prudentius, we've got the wonderful anonymous composers of the plain chant, we've got Theodoricus Petri, who adapted the melody, Henry Thomas Smart, who harmonized the melody, and the wonderful J.M. Neale, who translated the text, all working together across the centuries. This is the kind of thing that happens in hymns. The text is a lovely natural translation of the Latin. J.M. Neale had a wonderful style. It's a beautiful, simple, heartfelt poem. It has lovely lines that sing very well. In the first stanza, we've got, He the source, the ending, He of the things that are, that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore. It's got that lovely small refrain, evermore and evermore. He was found in human fashion, death and sorrow here to know, that the race of Adam's children, doomed by law to endless woe, may not henceforth die and perish in the dreadful gulf below, evermore and evermore. So it's a Christmas hymn. It's describing the birth of Jesus, found in human fashion. Hymn and chant and high thanksgiving, and unwearied praises be, honour, glory, and dominion, and eternal victory, evermore and evermore. It's a lovely flow to it. I like it a lot. My mother loved this hymn, and she was the one that introduced it to us. It's not easy to make Latin sound so natural and poetic in English. J.M. Neale was a great writer. We'll talk more about him again in the future. He's an important figure in the history of classic hymns. Anyway, that's enough talk. I shall sing some of the hymn of the Father's Love Forgotten to the tune Corde Natus. Thank you for your patience.
Of the Father's love begotten, ere the worlds began to be, He is Alpha and Omega, He the source, the ending, He of the things that are, that have been, and in future years shall be, evermore and evermore. O ye heights of heaven, adore Him. Angel hosts His praises sing.
That's a beautiful hymn. Praise be to God.